Hello, this is David Bernstein. I am the founder of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, and this is the Jewish Contrarians podcast. And I'm here with my partner in thought crime, Brandy Shafatinsky. Hello, Brandy.
Hey, David.
All right, so we've provocatively titled this today, Has Free Speech Gone Too Far? I will say that that's Brandy's title, but I welcome the conversation because I think it could be really interesting. And if with any luck, we're going to get a little bit of contention in this. So let's give it a shot. But I'm going to start out with my usual rant and see if Brandy thinks I'm off kilter, but then we'll go back and forth. So when we talk about free speech, we really mean two different but related things. First is the First Amendment, right? Which not every country has, but in our country, we have a First Amendment that protects the rights of free speech for individuals and prevents the government from unduly interfering in our right to speech. Now, there are some exceptions to free speech. You can't engage in violence. Let's start there. In other words, at Harvard, when those students were accosting the Jewish student on campus who was filming them, that was a violation of his rights. That was not an exercise in free speech. They were engaging in what probably lawyers would call false imprisonment, and so that's not protected activity at all. Now, another case is the case of incitement. Now, what do we mean by incitement? You can say something more general, like Zionists ought to be killed. I mean, it's a horrible thing to say, but unless you are specific and imminent, then it is not considered a violation. It's considered legal. So if you say we should kill all the Zionists on our campuses right now, that would be considered incitement and therefore not protected by the First Amendment. We also have other law besides the First Amendment, which can regulate speech. So in particular settings. So for example, we have Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And what that does is it prevents you from creating a hostile environment, a pervasively hostile environment in an institution, and campuses are covered through the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. And Jews, as of several years ago, were included as a protected group there. So if Jewish students feel that they're being harassed, they can bring suit against the university. So let's say, for example, Students for Justice in Palestine has targeted a group of students at Hillel, and they're following them around the campus, and they're yelling at them while they're in class, whatever. That creates a pervasively hostile environment that probably would be considered a violation of their speech, and the university itself, not their violation of free speech, would be considered a discrimination. And the university itself then has an obligation to intervene and to stop that hostile environment, because the university itself is implicated in the creation of a hostile environment, even if it's not the university that is doing it. The university is permitting it. It's allowing it to happen. Like at a workplace, for example, it's a hostile environment in the workplace, even if it's not the manager who's doing the harassing. It can be somebody else in the workplace that's doing the harassing, creating that hostile environment. So that's obviously the First Amendment is more complicated than that, but that's sort of the broad outlines of what the First Amendment allows. Now, when we speak of free speech, we generally are not just talking about the First Amendment. In fact, a lot of times today, when we talk about free speech, we actually are talking about a culture of free speech. When we speak of cancel culture, we're not worried that the government is going to cancel us usually, but we're worried that a censorious environment has set in that is preventing people from speaking their minds, that is creating a culture that is prohibitive of free speech. Sometimes we speak of the Overton window, and by that we mean, what is the range of acceptable speech in culture that would that we should all respect, versus what is considered, speech that would be derogatory, demeaning, that one might be fired from a workplace, or one might be sort of told to that they're engaging in horrific behavior, and everybody should sort of banish them from their social media outlets or whatever. Again, it's not an act of government that is doing it, but rather individuals or institutions that are stifling what we might consider the free exchange of ideas that is so important for society. Um, and so I mean that when I'm talking about free speech, I mean in both of those senses. And here we are. Okay, I don't know what happened there, but I'm back. Make sure I'm using the right mic. I'm sorry, since I got it off. Somehow I hit something. All right. Well, you're seeing me and you're hearing me, so something came something disconnected from my computer. But I think you hear me, right? You hear me, right, Brandy?
Yeah.
All right.
We hear you.
So let's so much for this new very fancy setup I have here with all this great lighting and technology. Of course, the first time I try to use it, we have a breakdown. So let's talk about this a little bit, Brandy. We're here we are at the present moment. We saw what happened at Rockefeller Center the other day where people were literally screaming, to shut down the Christmas tree. There might be illegal activity in there, by the way. I mean, again, we agree that the police have to police, right? If people are engaging in illegal activity, if they're physically harassing somebody, if they're inciting violence, that should not be allowed. And is it, and it's one thing, by the way, to protest in Times Square or Rockefeller Center and say from the river to the sea. It's another thing on college campuses. One could argue that would not be tolerable if it was done to other minority groups. And there's a question of equal protection there, that might be considered a violation of university policy, which is another issue that comes here. So maybe I've just contradicted myself. Maybe we're dealing with really three layers. One is the First Amendment. The second is a culture of free speech. And then there's sort of the matter of what a university's policy says, if we're talking about universities in particular. So do you think, Brandy, that free speech has gone too far? And if so, what do you mean by that?
I'm not sure if it's gone too far, or if it's just being the protection for free speech is being misused. And we can
Brandy, I do not hear you, which means that something came disconnected in my.
Okay.
Now go ahead.
Can you hear me?
I do not hear you. Let me change the. Okay, go ahead.
Brandy, go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, you can hear me.
Yeah.
I don't think David can hear me.
I am sorry. I do not. Let me try putting this somewhere in my.
How about now?
Now, Brandy, can you talk?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Okay. And something happened to my volume control.
Brandy, why don't you go ahead and make your point?
And still say, okay. So I was just going to say that I don't know if free speech has gone too far as much as it's being misused. And an example I was going to give is we see on school campuses, what's happening is administrators.
Brandy, is it possible that your mic is not working, or I'm not able to hear you at all?
No.
You hear yourself.
And Dan can hear me. Dan, I don't know if you can message David, let him know.
Because I just ran a test of my speakers.
Oh, strange.
I apologize, folks, if there's anyone hearing this live. We're going to edit it out of the thing, but we're not, unfortunately. We are having technical difficulties, which is one of the problems of going live and using a different system. I think what I'm going to do is get on my other computer in another room and rejoin this. So hold off, and hopefully there's not too many live listeners that are being.
Go ahead, Brandy. You might as well.
I can wait for him to rejoin if you want to wait. Tell me.
Right. There's three listeners. We have to ask them.
Bear with. I mean, I'm having technical difficulties, and I'm joining from my phone instead of my laptop. So it's one of those days.
So,
Dan, you can join. Come on camera.
no way. I don't have my makeup on. Someone wrote, we'll listen later.
Yeah.
All right. Well, yeah, I don't have much to. The only thing I found interesting what David was saying that might be interesting is there might be a difference between a public university and a private university in terms of whether policy can be implemented.
Yeah, that's true. I know that I've heard people talk about that difference a little bit between public and private universities, and where private universities usually adopt the same standards as a public university, but I don't know what that means for enforcement.
Yeah, I mean, I think
everybody, I'm back.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to get off. I'll be background guy now.
Hey,
All right, thanks.
So sorry about the technical difficulty. All right. So Brandy, I don't know anything that you said. So why don't you start all over?
I'll rewind.
Okay.
I was saying that I don't know if free speech has gone too far as much as it's being misused. And an example that I would give is, of course, people are free to protest. That doesn't absolve, say, a university administration from then protecting other students from that protest. And that seems to be a little bit about what we're seeing. We're seeing that university administrators, too many of them, say, well, free speech, students can protest, faculty members can say what they want, free speech, without also paying attention to their responsibility to then not infringe on different rights for the rest of the student population. An example is, of course, if students want to stage a sit-in and protest, that may be very well in their legal right. But the question is, do they have the right then to infringe on another student or faculty member's freedom of movement? So their ability to get to and from class. And a very recent example that happened a couple of weeks ago at UC Santa Cruz is there was this huge anti-Israel protest that got so out of hand that it blocked the main entrance to campus. Now, blocking an entrance, at least in the state of California, and I'm not an attorney, but I remember this from domestic violence work, blocking an exit is criminal. It's illegal. You can't block someone from exiting. And the administration did not take that into consideration. Instead, they said, oh, free speech, right to protest. I don't think that free speech and the right to protest absolves leadership from their other responsibilities. And that's the part where we're seeing free speech go too far. It's being used as a shield against any other responsibility a leader has.
Yeah. So there was a young woman who was interviewed about and expressing her frustrations on why her pro-Palestine protests were being shut down at the University of Columbia social work school. And what was actually happening is they were doing sit-ins in the building, which were not authorized because this is a lobby and you're not allowed to do that. And the school doesn't have to allow that. They're violating school policy. You could allow that. I guess the school could say, okay, you can rent out the lobby on a given day, but that's not what happened. They didn't have the proper permission to do that. So to me, in some cases, I'm not sure if those are the hardest cases. I think you would agree. I'm assuming that if the pro-Palestinian group on campus wants to just hold a protest and they're going to yell and they're going to go around and say from the river to the sea, we're not telling the university stop that. Or are we? I understand that. I think that it usually and almost always means the destruction of Israel. Is that within the Overton window in the sense of polite speech? Like, would it be okay for a employer to say, well, if you're going to chant that, you shouldn't, I don't want you to work in my company? And I would argue, yeah, that is actually acceptable. That is a call. It is widely understood as a call for violence. Does that mean that I want the university to actively police that?
I personally wouldn't. Now, let's say you had even a more aggressive protest where they were calling for the Intifada, a global Intifada. That's a more explicit call for violence than From the River to the Sea, which you can at least offer a plausible alternative. And I think that, again, that shouldn't be considered acceptable in polite company speech. And I think that the people who do that should be called on the carpet, and it shouldn't be considered acceptable to talk like that in polite company. But whether I want the school to say, well, that's impermissible. And the answer, and if they have policies that they would enforce with other groups, this is again where we get caught up in these two different standards, right? There's a standard of that they apply to many other marginalized communities that would not be allowed you would not be allowed to march through campus and say something that could be interpreted as violence, or calling for violence, let's say. So Jews, I think, understandably demand equal protection there. And yet, at the same time, I don't want to end free speech, because I know that in places where there's very low standards of free speech, there also tends to be more hostility towards Jews. I mean, if you look at the fire ranking of the campuses that are most stifling of free speech, it is last Harvard and second to last University of Pennsylvania. And those are two of the worst places right now when it comes to anti-Israel activism and hostility. So, how do you square all that?
I mean, I think that part of the issue that we're not considering is free speech goes both ways. An individual has the right to pretty much say whatever he or she wants to say, and the right to protest pretty much anything that they want to protest. They don't have the right to endanger other people while they're doing it. So an example of, say, the lobby protest at the School of Social Work at Columbia, well, there are limits to how many people can, because of fire hazard and fire codes, how many people can occupy a certain space. That's why when people have big protests, they have to get permits for them. And in doing that, there are regulations on how people freely express themselves, because they are in a space that isn't their own. It's a shared space. And then the other piece is, it's not so much about, even though I think about it a lot, what would be allowed and permissible for another minority, another group of Americans. Minority, majority doesn't matter, because we all are entitled to civil rights. But the other part of it isn't so much whether a protest against another group would be allowed. It's, would another group of protesters be allowed? And an example that we've seen is the protests, say, outside of abortion clinics against choice. The protests that Westboro Baptist Church has done all over the place. Those protesters were, rightfully or wrongfully, depending on your ideology, demonized. But these protesters aren't. And that's where
are they allowed? Are they? First of all, answer. I think you have to answer the first question. Mm-hmm. What do we want the university authorities to do? Westboro Baptist Church comes to campus. They're not. Let's say they're not going outside. Let's say the African American Student Union or the Hillel or something like that. They're simply marching in the middle of the campus oval with a few signs. Horrendous things. It's on campus property. Should the university allow that? Would they allow it?
The university does not have to. Universities do not have to allow outside groups to come on a campus.
Let's say it's a group of students that are associated with it.
The university has every right to recognize or de-recognize a student group based on ideology. They do, because it's associated with the university, not just the name and the reputation, but they get school funds to operate. A student group does. Like, this isn't just an ideological thing. I can't just all of a sudden say, well, I'm going to, associate as a student group on Yale and they have to accept me because free speech. It doesn't work that way. There's a process. And my ask is that the universities actually apply their processes to all groups and pay attention to what type of campus climate they want. Just like donors have the right to stop funding an institution that they feel no longer represents them, a university has a right to say this student group, this ideology that's coming on campus is not representative of the campus climate we want. Now, the students are free to say what they want, but that doesn't mean we have to, as an institution, recognize that organization.
Right. I don't think a state university, at least I think a private university probably has a lot more latitude on this, can arbitrarily deny an application of a student group based on free speech grounds. So, for example, I think if there was a group of students who wanted to represent the Westboro Baptist Church on their campus, and they applied and they went through the process, that a state university cannot deny them that. I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but that's my understanding. Is that
I disagree. I'm going to be contrary. I disagree with that, because if the ideology of that student group violates another school policy, whether it's a public or private institution, or whether it violates state or federal statute, the university, whether it's public or private, can deny that student group, because they're then using public funds. You can't use public funds to violate constitutional rights.
Right. No, but let's okay. Westboro, or we can come up with a different example. Doesn't necessarily say, I don't think you Jews have the right to speak. I think you're just horrible human beings. Okay. And that's speech. And I think it would be, if that's what they're saying, we want to have a platform for being able to say that, I think the university probably has to grant them that. Now, whether they would actually grant them that or try to violate their own, violate their First Amendment rights, I don't know. They may try to come up with some way around it to prevent them from doing it, because they know it would be a catastrophe. But I think that the university probably has to give them the right to do that, as long as they're not advocating for something very specific that would violate another group's rights.
I don't know. I don't think it's as clear cut, because
we're gonna get some outside validation on that, because that is not a question of whether it should, or it's a question of whether they legally would be obligated to. And I would love to hear. I'm gonna check with some of my favorite First Amendment attorneys on that and see what they say.
I want you to check with some of your least favorite ones.
Yeah, my least favorite ones, right? The ones who are right. Yeah, but look, I mean. Yeah. Would you represent the Westboro Church, is the question I would ask, if they had applied, if they had students to apply. So yeah, there's those questions, but I feel like still I haven't gotten a straight answer from you about whether you think it's if you're the president of Ohio State University, I'll go with my alma mater, why not? And there's a Students for Justice in Palestine that has done nothing to violate these other students' rights. They have not done any direct incitement. They haven't gone and physically accosted students or marched, in front of Hillel and started, yelling at them, which you could argue creates a hostile environment. But they go, they apply, they get their they get their permission to go out in the middle of the campus oval, as we used to call it. And they just go march around with their Palestinian flags and say, from the river to the sea. It's a state university. Are you going to allow that?
Yes.
Okay.
I don't know about the from the river to the sea. I would argue that a genocidal chant should not be, and a threat should not be slogans used on campus. I think that crosses the line. But it's my issue isn't with a protest, even a protest I disagree with. My issue is when that protest then infringes on the rights of other groups of people. So you can, free speech is fine, but there's such thing as harassment. So when does free speech become harassment? Well, we've seen it, right? We've seen these students target Jewish students and faculty, surround the Hillel. That's not those things aren't acceptable. Somebody tweeted this, and I'm blanking on who it was, and I retweeted it, but people have the right to make a fool of themselves. Have at it. You don't have the right to threaten someone else or harass someone else. That crosses the line.
Yeah. I would bet you if we came up with 100 examples and we were very clear on what they were, we probably would agree on almost all of them. Maybe there'd be a couple where we might even contradict ourselves on any given day, depending on what our mood is that day. But I was reading before we got on, I read FIRE. FIRE is the First Amendment free speech organization. I admire them greatly. I don't know if they consider themselves free speech absolutists, but they're certainly, in the free speech game. And I was reading what they consider the parameters of free speech on campus, and all the stuff that I talked about in the First Amendment, violence, incitement. they would say is a clear violation. So all the examples, as specific as what you're talking about, that crossover that violates somebody else's rights, they would say that that is not allowed. In fact, they said in that write-up that some of what they've seen on campus were specific violations of other people's rights and are not protected first free speech. And so I'm not sure that there's a lot of controversy there, for me at least. Like, or if FIRE is going to say that it's not permissible speech, then I think we can all agree that it's not permissible speech. It's in these cases where I worry that the university or the institution is applying a different standard for other groups. That's where I get very uncomfortable, because all of a sudden I say, well, why shouldn't Jews have the same equal protection, even if I don't like the protection? Even if I don't think that should be the standard used for any group, I want it to be, whatever standard there is, I want it to be applied equally. And I'm not sure that's the case. It's hard to sometimes come up with an exact analogy that doesn't, set off alarm bells, or one can contest. But but we've seen universities in particular act very aggressively to prevent political speech sometimes from happening, because they might cause harm to another group. Recently I heard about a detransitioner coming to speak to a campus. And I think the university had to allow it in the end, but a bunch of professors called together something like a healing session and so forth. The other thing that's, by the way, very interesting is that universities and others institutions have to actually respect the right of the hearer to be able to listen to speech. So it is a violation of free speech if I come to something and we allow the heckler's veto to take place, allow people to go and scream down the speaker. So and very often I find myself on that worried more about that than I do about people engaging in free speech. Like, I want the judge who was appointed by Trump to be able to speak in Stanford Law School without being interfered with. And that is considered, the student who wants to listen to that has a right to be able to hear that as well. So anyway, any final thoughts on this? I
will say, I think that the things that we discussed here were relatively cut and dry, and I don't think that's what we're seeing on campuses, though. I think what we're seeing on campuses is university administrators hiding behind the shield of free speech to kind of shirk their responsibility to keep all of their students safe. And I stand by what I'd said a few weeks ago. If university administrators aren't going to keep their students and faculty safe, another authority has to. It's their responsibility, because we're not seeing free speech demonstrations and protests. We're seeing threats. We're seeing harassment to a level that I would guess, I don't need to guess, so look at the past. When it's happened to other groups of people, other ethnic communities, those students have been protected. And right now we're not seeing Jewish students and faculty protected.
Yeah, you used the example of sort of Jim Crow, and what you found there was when local law enforcement wasn't enforcing civil rights statutes in an area because they were run by a racist sheriff or whatever, the FBI would come in and have to actually protect the students because they were violating federal statutes, so they could claim jurisdiction in those cases. And I think the same is here. Look, what was very frustrating to me was when there were some students at MIT who clearly crossed the line and engaged in illegal activity, and the university decided not to discipline them because they thought that could be used to expel those students based on their student visas. They were from other countries. And I thought that that's outrageous. Like, to me, you're going to privilege the rights, or you're going to privilege, and they don't have a right, by the way, to stay under any circumstances, those students being able to study at your university over protecting the Jewish students whose rights that they violated in their aggressive physical activity. To me, that was outrageous. And I think that a student who felt afflicted by that, who was affected by that, could probably sue the university or sue those students who violated their rights. But I agree with you. I think there's a lot of examples where the university hasn't stepped in. If the law enforcement is shuttling a group of students behind the back alley of the university buildings so that they can get into campus to avoid raucous campus protests that are aimed at stopping them from walking freely. Because you know that they could actually be accosted on the way there, that it's aimed at them, then the university is not doing its job.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we're seeing. And I mean, there's another instance out of UC Santa Cruz where you have an administration that is actually preventing students from getting protection from law enforcement because maybe they don't like the optics of it. I'm not sure. Either way, I think that it's irresponsible for a university administration to try to hide behind the shield of free speech, to not do what they're supposed to be doing for their campus community.
Yeah. And as the free speech advocate that I am, I want us to be cognizant of when free speech is genuinely allowed, even when it's the kind of speech that I detest the most. And so I want to check myself in the same time, because I see the overall atmosphere and I see what you're saying. And I think you're absolutely right that a lot of universities have hidden behind free speech, but that does clearly cross the line. That does,
it's
that
not,
is either violent. Yeah.
It's not just that. We already see what is happening at these protests and demonstrations. So if you're going to allow them to go on, as many will argue you should under the rights of free speech, then at least have the adequate protections for the rest of the campus community. That's the bar, at least that. So make sure there's enough security, make sure students can get to and from class, make sure students can eat in their dining halls without being accosted or harassed. And then let whatever free speech happen on campus that you want to let happen on campus.
Agreed. All right. Well, I'm not sure we found that point of contrarianism, but I'm sure there's going to be cases that emerge in this atmosphere that challenge us in that way, and we'll look out for them. So I think that's a wrap. Thank you, Brandy. Shabbat shalom.
Thanks, David. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom, everyone. Be well.